The first snow hit Dakota Territory on September 23, 1877, 6 weeks before anyone expected it. Ingrid Halvorsen watched from her cabin window as 3 inches fell in 2 hours, then stopped abruptly, leaving the prairie white and silent under a sky the color of slate. Her neighbors, the Donnelly family 2 miles east, lost their entire winter's firewood supply that morning. Water seeped through their woodpile covering, froze overnight, then thawed in the brief afternoon sun, turning 2 cords of split oak into sodden, useless weight. They'd burn through their emergency kerosene by November and freeze by January if the winter ran true to form. But Ingrid's woodpile, 4 cords of cottonwood and ash she'd split herself over 6 months, stayed bone dry in a place no one suspected existed, 7 feet beneath her cabin floor. She'd dug the cave in secret during the spring thaw, working at night when her neighbors assumed she was sleeping. The entrance sat beneath her kitchen table, concealed by a trapdoor she'd fitted so precisely that the hairline crack disappeared when she scattered ash across it. The chamber below measured 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet deep, dimensions she'd calculated based on the volume of wood she'd need and the insulation properties of compacted earth. She'd carved it from clay-heavy soil that held its shape without timber bracing, removing 672 cubic feet of earth 1 bucketful at a time, hauling it in darkness to a ravine half a mile north where spring runoff would scatter the evidence. The work had taken 83 nights. Most folks in Pierce County thought Ingrid Halvorsen was touched in the head. A Norwegian widow of 41 years who'd claimed her own quarter section under the Homestead Act after her husband died of typhoid on the wagon journey west. That was unusual enough, but she'd refused to remarry, rejected help from neighboring families, and built her cabin alone using techniques nobody recognized. She notched her logs differently, angled her roof at 52 degrees instead of the standard 35, and positioned her door facing southeast instead of south, like every other structure for 30 miles. "Woman doesn't understand basic shelter," said Marcus Webb, a former Army quartermaster who'd built housing for 3 frontier posts. "That roof pitch'll catch snow like a scoop. Wind'll tear through that door placement come February. She'll be dead by spring, mark my words." But Ingrid understood something Marcus Webb didn't. She'd grown up in Trondheim, where winter meant 4 months of darkness and temperatures that dropped to -22 Fahrenheit on gentle nights. Her grandfather had been a mountain shepherd who'd survived 7 decades by reading weather patterns in cloud formations, animal behavior, and the smell of the wind. He'd taught her that moisture killed more people than cold, that dry cold at -15 was survivable, but wet cold at 28 degrees would kill you in your sleep. The Dakota winters reminded her of home, brutal, long, and absolutely unforgiving of carelessness. She'd studied the territory for 2 full seasons before filing her claim, watching how snow accumulated, where wind came from, how the ground froze and thawed. Every decision she made about her homestead emerged from those observations, and the Firewood cave was the most critical element of her entire survival system. The skeptics gathered at her cabin door on October 4th after word spread about the Donnellys' ruined woodpile. There were 4 of them. Marcus Webb, naturally, still convinced her whole operation was doomed. Sarah Pritchard, a schoolteacher from Boston who'd homesteaded with her brother and considered herself an expert on frontier efficiency. Tom Baxter, a German immigrant who'd been a master carpenter in Hamburg and couldn't abide improvised construction. And James Thornton, a former railroad worker who'd seen enough winter deaths to take survival preparation seriously. "We're here as neighbors," Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and condescension educated women sometimes wielded like a blade. "You can't possibly have enough firewood stored properly. The Donnellys are experienced homesteaders and they lost their entire supply. You're one woman alone. Let us help before it's too late." Ingrid invited them inside for coffee, which surprised them. Most frontier women would have bristled at the implication they couldn't manage. She poured from a pot she kept warm on her cook stove, served it in tin cups without apology for the lack of china, and waited while they arranged themselves around her kitchen table. The table sat directly over the trapdoor. She could feel the slight coolness rising through the floorboards, a temperature differential of maybe 8 degrees that kept her kitchen noticeably more comfortable than other cabins. None of them noticed. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her English carrying the slight musical inflection of Norwegian vowels. But my firewood's accounted for. 4 cords split and stored since April. Stored where? Tom Baxter's eyes scanned the cabin interior. 1 room, 16 by 20 feet, with a sleeping loft and a cook stove. No firewood visible anywhere except a small stack beside the stove, maybe 3 days' worth. You can't keep wood outside in Dakota winter. Moisture gets in, wood swells, won't burn clean. Smoke'll choke you, fire won't hold heat. Basic physics. It's not outside, Ingrid said. Not in here either, Marcus Webb added, gesturing at the obvious absence of a massive woodpile. Unless you've got some kind of magic cupboard we can't see. Something like that. The conversation continued in circles for 20 minutes, them insisting she accept help relocating firewood from the communal woodlot before the next snow, her politely declining, them growing increasingly frustrated with her stubbornness. Finally, James Thornton, who'd been quiet throughout, spoke up. I worked railroad construction from Omaha to Cheyenne, he said. Saw men die from stupidity more than bad luck. Saw women die because they were too proud to accept help. You seem like a capable woman, Mrs. Halverson, but winter up here doesn't care about capability. It cares about preparation. If you won't tell us where your wood is, at least let us see that it's truly dry and accessible. Ingrid considered this. She'd planned to keep the cave secret until spring, but these 4 represented the community's leadership, and their skepticism would poison relationships she might need later. All right, she said. She stood, moved the coffee pot, and gripped the table edge. Help me shift this. They helped her slide the heavy pine table 3 feet east, revealing the floor beneath. At first they saw nothing, just pine planks worn smooth by boot traffic, gaps between boards sealed with oakum and pitch. Then Ingrid knelt, worked her fingers into a crack they'd mistaken for a natural joint, and lifted. A section of floor came up in one piece, 3 planks joined by hidden cross braces, hinges concealed beneath the floorboards on the east side. The trapdoor measured 30 inches by 24 inches, large enough to pass firewood through, small enough to maintain structural integrity. Below it, a ladder descended into darkness. Good Lord, Sarah Pritchard whispered. Ingrid lit a lantern and climbed down. The ladder was 12 rungs of ash wood, each rung tested to hold 200 pounds. At the bottom, she raised the lantern, and the cave revealed itself in stages. First the near wall with its neat stacks of split cottonwood, then the far wall with ash and elm, then the ceiling where she'd carved channels to direct any seepage toward drainage sumps in the corners. The air smelled of earth and wood, dry as paper, cool but not cold. The temperature down here stayed consistent year-round, she'd discovered. 53 degrees in summer, 48 degrees in winter, protected by 7 feet of soil insulation from the savage temperature swings above. One by one, they climbed down. Tom Baxter ran his hands along the walls, testing the structural integrity. This is cut from clay hardpan, he said, his voice carrying a note of reluctant admiration. Must have taken months. He examined the ceiling channels, traced the drainage system, calculated the load-bearing capacity of the earthen arch. You excavated this yourself, all of it? Starting in March, finished in May, 83 nights of work. Marcus Webb picked up a piece of split cottonwood, examined its moisture content by weight and smell. This is dry as kilnwood, he admitted. Drier than anything stored above ground could be. How? Earth breathes, Ingrid explained. Not like air breathes, but it pulls moisture through capillary action. In a sealed chamber cut from the right soil, at the right depth, moisture naturally migrates toward the walls and dissipates. Long as the wood doesn't touch the walls and air can circulate, it stays dry. My grandfather taught me that. Norwegian shepherds used to store hay in mountain caves, same principle. Come spring, hay was drier than anything in a barn. James Thornton was examining the construction methodology, how she'd carved the chamber in a dome shape to distribute weight, how she'd positioned support pillars of undisturbed earth at strategic intervals, how she'd left the floor uneven to prevent water pooling. This isn't improvisation, he said. This is engineering. Old engineering, but sound. I've seen root cellars that collapsed after one winter. This'll stand for decades. Root cellars are different, Ingrid said. They're designed to maintain humidity for vegetables. This needed to be dry. Different excavation pattern, different depth, different soil selection. I tested 3 sites before I found clay content high enough to hold without timber bracing. If you brace with timber, you introduce organic material that holds moisture and attracts rot. Unbraced earth, if it's the right earth, stays stable indefinitely. The 4 of them climbed back up, emerged into the kitchen, stood blinking in the lantern light like miners surfacing after a long shift. Sarah Pritchard was the first to speak. "You dug that alone? At night? Why didn't you ask for help?" "Would you have helped me dig a hole under my cabin floor?" Ingrid asked mildly. "Or would you have tried to talk me out of it?" Sarah had the grace to look embarrassed. "I would have tried to talk you out of it. I would have said it was dangerous and unnecessary, and there were easier solutions." "There aren't easier solutions," Tom Baxter said. "Not for dry firewood storage in Dakota winter. I've built a dozen woodsheds, 3 with double walls and sealed roofs. Every single one had moisture problems by January. Snow gets in when you open the door. Temperature swings create condensation. Wood absorbs moisture from the air on warm days and holds it when temperature drops. This," he gestured at the floor, "this solves all those problems. It's brilliant." But Marcus Webb wasn't convinced. "It's an interesting solution to a problem that doesn't exist," he said. "The Donnellys had bad luck with early snow. Most years a good woodshed works fine. This is over-engineered, impractical. You spent 3 months digging a hole when you could have built a shed in 3 days." "A shed that would fail," Ingrid said quietly. "A shed that's worked for thousands of frontier families." "Has it? How many families do you know who burned wet wood all winter, choked on smoke, couldn't maintain heat, and told themselves it was normal? How many children got pneumonia from sleeping in cold cabins because the fire wouldn't hold overnight with damp wood?" Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. James Thornton was nodding slowly. "She's got a point," he said. "I've seen it. Everyone sees it, we just accept it as part of winter. You burn through twice as much wood as you should because half of it's too wet to burn efficiently. You wake up at 2 a.m. to feed the fire because it won't hold. You breathe smoke because wet wood won't draft properly. We think that's just how winter is. Because we've been doing it wrong," Tom Baxter said almost to himself. "All of us, for generations. We've been storing firewood the way our fathers did, in sheds and under tarps, and accepting the moisture problems as inevitable. Listen, if you're interested in how frontier families actually survived, not the sanitized version from history books, but the real techniques that kept people alive through winters that killed their neighbors, hit that subscribe button. We're documenting traditional wisdom that's being lost, methods that worked when failure meant death, knowledge that deserves to be preserved. Join us in keeping these stories alive." The winter of 1877 to 1878 became known as the Iron Winter across Dakota Territory. The first serious snow fell on October 28th, 14 inches in 18 hours, driven by 40-mile-per-hour winds. Temperature dropped to minus 31 degrees by mid-November and wouldn't climb above zero for 47 days straight. Storms arrived every 4 to 6 days, each dumping 8 to 20 inches of snow. The Donnelly family burned their furniture to survive: chairs, table, bed frame, then floorboards. Their cabin temperature hovered around 38 degrees on good days. Margaret Donnelly, 7 months pregnant, developed pneumonia in December. She survived. The baby didn't. They buried him in a snowdrift because the ground was frozen solid. Sarah Pritchard burned through her firewood by January 12th. She'd calculated for a normal winter, 5 cords for 4 months. This winter demanded 8 cords in 10 weeks. She burned her books next, watching a complete Dickens set go up in flames, then textbooks, then dried grass twisted into bundles that produced more smoke than heat. Marcus Webb's traditional woodshed failed exactly as Ingrid predicted. Every time he opened the door, snow blew in. Temperature differentials created condensation that froze on the wood, melted during warm spells, froze again. By late December, his firewood wore a shell of ice. He burned through everything by February 20th and resorted to digging frozen buffalo chips from beneath 4 feet of snow. Tom Baxter's masterpiece German-style woodshed with ventilation channels and raised floors failed spectacularly. The ventilation became highways for snow. By mid-February, his 7 cords were entombed in ice, inaccessible until spring. He moved in with the Thornton family and helped them burn their furniture. James Thornton had tried digging his own cave after seeing Ingrid's. He hit bedrock at 4 feet, struck an underground spring at the second site. Suffered a cave-in at the third that nearly killed him. The geology near Ingrid's cabin was unique. Perfect clay content, adequate depth to bedrock, no groundwater. By the time he'd given up, winter had arrived. Ingrid's cabin maintained 68 to 72 degrees all winter. Her firewood burned clean and hot. She could load her stove at 10 p.m. and have coals glowing at 6 a.m. She used 1/3 less wood than calculated because dry wood burns with 3 times the efficiency of damp wood. A fact her grandfather had taught her and frontier America was relearning through bitter experience. The crisis came on February 7th when a blizzard moved in that lasted 6 days. Visibility dropped to 0. Temperature fell to -44 degrees. The storm came from the northeast with winds that sustained 50 miles per hour and gusted to 75. Snow didn't fall so much as materialize horizontally, driven by wind that sounded like cannon fire. Cabin doors froze shut, blown snow filled every gap and crack, and chimneys backed up from the pressure differential. People died in their cabins from smoke inhalation. Others died trying to reach their livestock barns, getting disoriented in the whiteout and freezing 10 feet from their doors. On the third day of the storm, Marcus Webb appeared at Ingrid's door. She almost didn't hear his knocking over the wind. When she opened the door, he stumbled inside. A frozen apparition, ice crusted in his beard, his face gray with cold, his fingers blackened with frostbite. Out of wood, he managed through chattering teeth. Burned everything. Can't feel my hands. She sat him by her stove, wrapped him in blankets, put hot coffee in his shaking hands. His fingers were bad, the tips of 4 fingers and both thumbs showing the waxy white of deep frostbite. She packed them in lukewarm water, slowly raising the temperature while he gasped with pain as circulation returned. "You were right," he said after an hour, when he could speak clearly again. "About all of it. The roof pitch. I watched snow slide off yours while mine's buried. The door placement. Your entrance is on the lee side of this storm. Mine catches the full wind. The firewood." He gestured helplessly at his ruined hands. "I burned everything in my cabin. Furniture, floorboards, part of my door. Wasn't enough. Wood was too wet, wouldn't hold heat. I was going to freeze to death in my own home." 2 days later, the Pritchard siblings arrived, along with Tom Baxter and James Thornton's entire family, his wife, 3 children, and his wife's elderly father. The storm had claimed 3 lives in Pierce County by then, and everyone recognized that traditional survival methods were failing against this particular winter's ferocity. Ingrid's cabin became a refuge by necessity. 10 people in a 16 by 20 foot space, survival by collective body heat and the steady warmth from her stove, fueled by firewood that burned clean because she'd had the foresight to keep it dry. She fed them from her stores, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, potatoes from her root cellar. She rationed carefully, making each meal stretch across more mouths than she'd planned for. The children slept in her loft, the adults on the floor around the stove wrapped in every available blanket and coat. And every morning she'd descend into her cave and bring up the day's firewood, enough to keep the stove burning steady, enough to keep 10 people alive while the storm tried to kill them. The skeptics watched her make those trips down and up, wood stacked in her arms, and something shifted in how they understood survival. This wasn't luck or divine favor. This was the result of observation, planning, knowledge passed down from people who'd survived worse winters than Dakota could throw at them, and the determination to do hard work in secret rather than seek approval from people who didn't understand the problem. On the 4th day, Sarah Pritchard asked to see the cave again. They descended together, 2 women separated by background and education, but united by the reality of frontier survival. Sarah examined the construction with new eyes, understanding now what she'd missed in October. "You didn't dig this for one winter," she said. "You dug it knowing you'd have winters like this. You prepared for the worst possible scenario. In Trondheim, my grandfather used to say, 'Hope for mild weather, prepare for death weather.' The mild weather takes care of itself. The death weather is what kills you if you haven't prepared. How did you know this winter would be death weather? I didn't, but I knew death weather would come eventually. Might be this year, might be 5 years from now. Didn't matter when. What mattered was being ready when it arrived." They emerged back into the crowded cabin. Tom Baxter was teaching Marcus Webb's damaged fingers to grip a coffee cup, working them through exercises to restore function. James Thornton was telling stories to his children, keeping them calm while the wind tried to tear the roof off. The elderly grandfather sat by the stove, absorbing heat like a lizard on a rock, silent but alive. This was frontier survival reduced to its essential truth: the knowledge, preparation, and resources to keep people breathing when nature attempted to stop them. The storm broke on the 6th day. They emerged into a landscape transformed, drifts reaching 16 feet high, the prairie sculpted into frozen waves, the sky a blue so deep it hurt to look at. The temperature had risen to -18 degrees, which felt almost warm after the preceding week. They made their way to their respective cabins, some to assess the damage, others to salvage what they could. Marcus Webb stayed with Ingrid for another week while his fingers healed, and she helped him rebuild his woodpile from her surplus. Word of the cave system spread through Pierce County and beyond. By March, 7 families had begun excavating their own underground firewood storage. Tom Baxter supervised the construction, applying his German engineering knowledge to Ingrid's Norwegian folk wisdom, creating a hybrid methodology that accounted for Dakota soil conditions. Not all attempts succeeded. Some hit bedrock, others struck water, one collapsed, but 4 families completed functional caves before the spring thaw. If you value knowledge like this, real survival techniques that worked when people's lives depended on getting it right, click that like button. It tells us these stories matter, that documenting frontier wisdom is worth continuing. One click, and it helps preserve these techniques for people who might need them someday. The spring of 1878 brought a reckoning. When the snow melted and communities could travel again, they counted the cost of the iron winter. 17 people had died in Pierce County alone, from cold, from smoke inhalation, from accidents while trying to reach firewood or livestock in blizzard conditions. The county's population dropped from 134 people in October to 117 in April. Some families left during the brief thaw in late March, vowing never to return. Others stayed, but with a new understanding of what frontier survival actually required. Ingrid's cave system became a focal point for that understanding. In late April, when the county held its first community gathering since October, people came to examine her cabin, to see the trapdoor, to descend into the earth and understand what had saved lives while traditional methods had failed. She gave tours patiently, explaining the geology, the excavation methodology, the physics of earth insulation and moisture migration. She showed them her grandfather's techniques, passed down from Norwegian mountains where survival had been refined across generations of brutal winters. Tom Baxter spent 3 weeks measuring Ingrid's cave, testing soil, calculating thermal properties. He emerged with a 16-page technical manual detailing excavation site selection, soil stability testing, optimal dimensions, and drainage systems. He shared it freely. By summer 1878, copies had spread across Dakota territory. Some adapted the design for root cellars, ice houses, storm shelters. The principle remained constant. Properly excavated earth provides insulation and moisture control that surface construction cannot match. Sarah Pritchard incorporated the cave into her schoolhouse curriculum, teaching excavation mathematics and geology. More importantly, she taught that a Norwegian widow's folk wisdom was as valuable as any textbook, that survival required humility and learning from unexpected sources. Marcus Webb lost 3 fingertips to frostbite, permanent reminders of his stubborn certainty. He became Ingrid's most vocal advocate, helping excavate caves for other families despite his damaged hands, determined to turn his mistake into something useful. James Thornton never built his own cave. The geology remained unsuitable. But he developed a deep friendship with Ingrid. His belief that women needed frontier protection, demolished not through argument but through her competence and the willingness to work 83 nights in secret rather than seek approval. By fall 1878, Ingrid's homestead had become a pilgrimage site for westward families. She'd greet them, show the construction, answer questions. Some men would bristle at taking advice from a woman. She'd let them. The prairie had a way of humbling people who confused pride with wisdom. The practical impact spread across the northern plains. Communities shared geological information, where clay content was right, where bedrock lay too shallow, where springs made digging impossible. They developed variants for different conditions. In sandy soil, they braced with stone. In rocky terrain, they used hillsides. In high water table areas, they built earth-bermed walls instead of full excavation. The core insight remained Ingrid's. Earth itself provided better insulation than any structure built upon it. By 1880, territorial homesteading guides included underground storage recommendations. By 1885, the practice had spread to Nebraska, Kansas, Montana, Minnesota. Variations appeared in different climates: earthen cellars in Texas for summer cooling, cave structures in Colorado for year-round preservation, dugout modifications in Oklahoma. The Norwegian Widow's Midnight Project had sparked a quiet revolution in frontier architecture. In 1889, a University of Minnesota professor studied what he called vernacular thermal engineering. His instruments confirmed what Ingrid knew intuitively. At 7 feet depth, earth temperature remained constant, creating natural refrigeration in summer and insulation in winter. He published in the Journal of Agricultural Engineering, crediting traditional Norwegian techniques adapted for American frontier conditions by Mrs. Ingrid Halvorsen. The paper showed underground storage reduced fuel consumption by 40 to 60%. It became required reading for agricultural engineers, but Ingrid cared less about academic validation than practical results. She measured success in simpler terms: families that survived winters they otherwise wouldn't have, children who didn't develop pneumonia from sleeping in cold cabins, fingers and toes that didn't turn black with frostbite. The iron winter had killed 17 people in her county. The winter of 1878-1879 killed 3. The winter of 1879-1880 killed none. The numbers told their own story. She lived on her homestead for 37 more years, teaching the technique to anyone who asked. Young homesteaders seeking guidance, engineers wanting principles, historians documenting frontier life. She'd take them into the earth, show them how to read soil by touch and smell, explain load-bearing capacity without mathematics. The teaching pleased her more than fame. Knowledge hoarded was knowledge lost. Knowledge shared became immortal. She died in 1914 at age 78. By then, underground storage had become standard across much of the northern plains. The specific implementations varied, but the core understanding had taken root. Earth itself provided resources that surface construction could never match: temperature stability, moisture control, protection from weather, structural integrity without expensive materials. Modern surveys of 19th century homesteads consistently find evidence of underground structures. Many have collapsed, but enough remain intact to demonstrate how widespread the practice became. At the Ingrid Halvorsen homestead, now a county historical park, visitors descend into the original cave, still stable after 140 years, still maintaining that constant cool temperature. The descendants of the Iron Winter's survivors carry stories of how their ancestors learned to respect knowledge from unexpected sources. Some can trace their existence to Ingrid's cave. If Marcus Webb had frozen, if the Pritchards had succumbed to pneumonia, if Baxter's family had perished in the 6-day blizzard, entire family trees would have ended before they began. That's frontier survival reality. People died from accumulated small failures: wet wood that wouldn't burn hot enough, inadequate insulation, insufficient preparation. The difference between survival and death came down to details: roof angle, door placement, firewood moisture content, excavation depth. Ingrid understood those details because she'd learned from people who'd survived by mastering them. There's a lesson for anyone facing overwhelming challenges. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the oldest, refined across generations, who couldn't afford mistakes. Sometimes innovation means looking backward, finding principles that worked before industrialization complicated everything. Sometimes survival requires ignoring what everyone else is doing and trusting knowledge from people who face similar problems elsewhere. The Firewood cave was all of those things: ancient wisdom applied to new circumstances, humble observation producing radical results, 83 nights of secret labor creating permanent change. It kept her alive, saved her neighbors, inspired modifications that spread across thousands of miles, and saved countless lives. Not bad for a Norwegian widow half the county thought was crazy. So here's the thing about frontier knowledge, traditional techniques, survival wisdom from people who lived when failure meant death. We're losing it. Every year, fewer people remember how things actually worked before modern convenience made us forget the basics. Every year, stories like Ingrid's fade a little more, replaced by sanitized histories that emphasize progress while forgetting the practical genius of people who solved problems with observation, patience, and hard work, rather than expensive technology. Subscribe to this channel if you want to help preserve these stories. Not for nostalgia's sake, but because the principles still work, the knowledge still matters, and understanding how people survived impossible conditions with limited resources remains valuable regardless of what century you're living in. The cave is still there, 7 feet beneath the prairie, waiting in cool darkness like it has for nearly a century and a half. The wood is long gone, burned generations ago or rotted to dust. But the space remains, a testament to what one woman understood that an entire community had to learn the hard way. Preparation beats hope, knowledge beats strength, and sometimes the best way forward requires looking back to people who figured it out long before we were born. That's worth remembering. That's worth preserving. That's worth passing on to whoever comes next and has to face their own version of impossible odds and death weather coming from the northeast with wind that sounds like cannon fire. Pay attention. Learn from people who survived. Dig deep, literally and figuratively. And when everyone tells you you're doing it wrong, consider the possibility that they're measuring with the wrong tools and that competence looks like madness right up until the moment it saves lives. That's the legacy of the Firewood Cave. That's the lesson of the Iron Winter. That's why we tell these stories,